Turn off. I turned it off. Jesus. In the mid-1990s, pro wrestling's cultural popularity had dipped in prominence from the rock and wrestling era. And as such, wrestling games did not put much stock in structural accuracy, even as games were becoming more generally complex. The most high-profile wrestling games at that moment were being made by Acclaim, the photographic Mortal Kombat pseudo-motion capture of WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, and WWF In Your House. In 1995, a company founded by Yukinori Taniguchi, based upon his nickname, Yuk, developed their first ever game, quite possibly the first ever 3D polygonal pro wrestling game, Tokon Retsuden, for famed Japanese pro wrestling company, New Japan. Retsuden means like legend, and Tokon roughly translates to fighting spirit, and is a fundamental tenet of the Japanese wrestling ecosystem. New Japan was not really a mainstream concern in America in 1995. So when it was localized for Western audiences, Tokon Retsuden was reskinned as Power Move Pro Wrestling. It is an identical game, other than changing the names and appearances of the characters from Japanese mainstays like Kaiji Muto, Riki Choshu, and Tatsumi Fujinami, to more wacky, funny little business like The Judge, Chain Gang, Malibu Mike, and Area 51. It's not a very deep game, functioning nearly entirely as a simple 1v1 combat experience, but the visuals are crisp, the controls are responsive, and the cartoony Americanized editions are fun.
249 pounds! Power Move Pro Wrestling's full-time dude, Malibu Mike Swanson! In the red corner!
The following month, in Japan, Yuke's put out the sequel to Tokon Retsuden, fittingly called Tokon Retsuden 2. The second game is essentially an upgraded expansion of the first. The graphics are much improved, the sound is vivid, the roster is large, even if I accidentally picked whoops, and even if it's fairly difficult to navigate the fully Japanese menus, the gameplay is fairly balanced between strikes, kicks, submissions, and runs, all mapped to an individual button. The game has also added tag team and battle royale options, and even if I never quite figured out how to actually take somebody out in the latter, it was really impressive to have 4 well-animated 3D guys at a decent frame rate battling at once in a 1996 PS1 game. Around the same time, a Japanese developer with the befuddling name of The Man Breeze, shortly thereafter renamed the Aki Corporation, produced their own 3D polygonal wrestling game on the PlayStation, called Virtual Pro Wrestling. Aki's game engine was similar to Yuke's, a button for grappling, a button for strikes, a button for running, a button for blocking. But everything runs a little smoother, a little more responsive. They had a wide variety of wrestlers, pretty much every major Japanese wrestler working at the time. Virtual Pro Wrestling was immediately popular, and Aki found an American distributor for their game in a stateside toy company called Toy Headquarters, or THQ. Virtual Pro was localized in America as basically a flip side of the Japanese licenses, as WCW vs. the World for the PlayStation, which was primarily a WCW game, but had a ton of Japanese wrestlers as well. THQ and Aki found themselves in such an advantageous working Western partnership that in the development of follow-ups to their split-version series, they completed the American version first. WCW NWO World Tour for the Nintendo 64 refined their gameplay engine for maximum approachability, building everything out of a grapple base. Simple moves up, down, left, and right. It wasn't well regarded critically since it's so straightforward, but casual gamers were picking it up in droves as pro wrestling began once again to make inroads into the American mainstream. World Tour was maybe the first US pro wrestling game that functioned as a party game experience with full use of the Nintendo 64's quad controller spread. The single-player mode was sort of a convoluted slog, but it became a go-to game for gaming with friends. I wasn't into pro wrestling yet when World Tour came out, but I played a ton of this game specifically, because it was so fun to play in a 4-top setup. Their next game made an even bigger splash. By 1998, pro wrestling was in what is considered its biggest cultural boom period, and THQ and Aki rose to the occasion with WCW NWO Revenge, which took the things World Tour did well and purified them, expanded them. The proprietary grapple system was refined, the graphics were improved, the roster was filled out. And they added additional modes, including a fairly sprawling championship mode that gave some measure of stakes to the proceedings. Revenge was an absolute sensation, becoming not only the highest-selling wrestling game on the N64, but one of the highest-selling on that system, period. Revenge melded that pick-up-and-play accessibility with the expanded roster of an American pro wrestling scene at its absolute commercial zenith. And it was a sensation around the world, a measuring stick for all wrestling games to come. One company that has been basically entirely left out of this retrospective on important late 90s wrestling games is arguably the biggest company of them all, the World Wrestling Federation. The WWF had a long-time exclusive contract for its games with the company Acclaim, who followed up the aforementioned Mortal Kombat photoplays of WrestleMania the arcade game and In Your House with the sloping, lackluster WWF Warzone, and its follow-up, WWF Attitude, a game I have covered to great success on this very channel. Warzone and Attitude had a fluid but ugly graphical style, and relied on a complicated, multi-step fighting game button string structure, but without the responsiveness that would be required to make that sort of style work. So instead, nearly every match in singles competition or with friends grinds down to a halting slap-and-hug fight, and matches drone on tediously until you hear every vocal sample on the game's audio and just want to give up forever. As I discussed in that episode, the WWF was so unsatisfied with the results in Warzone and Attitude that they acquired the license to the THQ Aki Engine series. So the game that in Japan was known as Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 became WWF WrestleMania 2000 in America, and expanded on the things that WCW NWO Revenge did well, not only refining the movesets and animations, as well as the huge benefit of replacing the increasingly distant roster of the dying WCW with the high-profile stars of the Attitude-era WWF, but also adding match types like cage matches, triple threats, and first blood, plus a deeply expanded Road to WrestleMania season mode. WWF WrestleMania 2000 is my favorite wrestling game of all time, and I've been playing it for decades since. At the same time that THQ was thriving on the N64, on the Japanese side, Yuke's had moved their new Tokon Retsuden game to the brand new hotness that was the Sega Dreamcast. Tokon Retsuden 4 builds on the previous entries. I loved how many options there were for entrances and arenas and things. The pageantry is a huge part of things that a lot of games missed, and overall, Part 4 was a well-liked hit again. Yuke's also produced a less high-profile wrestling game for the PlayStation, a release for the Japanese budget title Simple 1500 series, simply called The Pro Wrestling, with no official licenses and some XP characters based on Japanese wrestling legends. They used this new license as a jumping-off point for their new game, their very first American licensed wrestling game for the World Wrestling Federation, and for our purposes, an intersection between our two protagonists, as WWF SmackDown for the Sony PlayStation was developed by Yuke's, and in the Western world, published by THQ. It used the same simplified Tokon engine that the Pro Wrestling did, but matched it to an insanely minute season mode. It had you booking through random house shows up to pay-per-views, and told you audience ratings and everything, and had little story intervals in between. It looks pretty rudimentary now, but it was the first time a wrestling game felt like it was investing in the narrative television show part of pro wrestling, an essential component that most games that treat it like a sport lack, and it garnered a lot of praise for its ambition. I tell you all of this so you can understand why excitement and expectations would be high for these titans of the late 90s wrestling video game landscape, THQ and Yuke's, to come together for a WWF game developed in tandem with Big Sega itself, being released on the highest-end console on the market, the Sega Dreamcast, especially since WWF SmackDown went so well. Could you imagine what these guys could do with 4 times the processing power of the PS1? The graphics could be so cool, the story mode could be so deep, it could have complex narratives, amazing branching pathways and story events, extravagant entrances. Maybe they could even have voiceover with the wrestlers. Can you imagine the immersion that a Sega Dreamcast WWF game could provide? The early reporting was enthusiastically hopeful for exactly these reasons, and many were at least hoping this could maybe, at worst, be a higher-level port of SmackDown, or an expansion therein. Those hopes were quickly dashed, though, because while those teams were working on a sequel to SmackDown, that's not what Dreamcast owners were getting. Instead, WWF Royal Rumble was apparently developed and simultaneously released as an arcade game. I can't get an exact date for the arcade version, but it doesn't appear that the disc version was greeted as a port of the arcade, so I'm guessing they came out around the same time. And as a result, WWF Royal Rumble for the Dreamcast is thin and weird. To focus on its primary mode, this game takes, let's call it liberties, with the format of the Royal Rumble match. If you're not familiar with the Royal Rumble as an in-real-life concept, let me take a second to tell you how my favorite match in the entire business works. Historically, the Battle Royal was a common wrestling match style, where 20 or 30 participants start in the ring and eliminate each other by throwing opponents over the top rope until the group thins out and one person eventually wins. The sheer mass of humanity was the selling point. The innovation of the Royal Rumble was to space out the proceedings. Instead of all 30 people starting at once, the match begins with 2 people drawn by random lottery, and then every 90 seconds or so, a big horn sounds and another wrestler comes out. This space allows for the telling of a ton of different little stories. Sometimes a favored wrestler draws a very early number and has to try to survive for an hour plus to get to the promised land. Sometimes a wrestler gets an advantageous number, fresher and more ready than the Iron Strivers. Sometimes 2 guys who are friends or partners draw the first 2 numbers and have to fight each other. Sometimes two rivals find themselves with an opportunity to finally throw down in the ring, or have to team up in a temporary alliance to clear space or an even bigger villain. Sometimes things get backed up and one big, important wrestler comes in and cleans house. Sometimes one wrestler gets a couple quick eliminations and finds themselves alone in the ring, just trying to eliminate each wrestler that enters. Sometimes a wrestler who hasn't been around in ages makes a surprise return, or an old legend comes back for one last hurrah. The aesthetics of the match, the anticipation of the countdown, the thunder of the horn. It's designed for maximum drama, appeal, and satisfaction. The winner gets a championship match against the heavyweight champion in the main event of the biggest show of the year, WrestleMania. So it also has very clear, potent, important, and understandable stakes. But even that, folks up and down the roster's prominence get a chance to shine, to matter. Now that you know what a Royal Rumble is and how it works, let me tell you that playing the Royal Rumble mode in WWF Royal Rumble for the Sega Dreamcast is among the most befuddling things I have ever played. After I picked my wrestler, the game began, and I saw 29 left to eliminate at the top. But as I watched CPU wrestler after CPU wrestler eliminate each other, I noticed that the number wasn't going down. I realized that the number only goes down if I do it. I personally have to eliminate 29 other wrestlers, which is not fun and not at all how anything works. And also, there's no urgency to worrying about what the other wrestlers are doing, because they're apparently just taking up space until I get around to eliminating them. Even weirder, the urgency comes from a timer that ticks down unless I eliminate other wrestlers, which adds more time to my countdown clock. In a Royal Rumble, the essence of this goes as long as it takes. The other thing that becomes clear very quickly is that WWF Royal Rumble absolutely does not have enough wrestlers in the game to comprise a complete 30-wrestler Royal Rumble field, much less one that features wrestlers being eliminated at an extended, constant rate. I did a double take. I thought my eyes were deceiving me when wrestlers I was sure I had personally eliminated were still in the match. But somewhere between the 4th or 5th Mankind, the 6th or 7th Kurt Angle, and the 8th or 9th Rikishi, I realized that eliminated wrestlers were simply coming back in. And not in any reasonable amount of time, just kinda every 7 or 8 seconds. Another random horn goes off, and another wrestler runs out. Sometimes in an alternate costume, but a lot of times not. They're just back again, filling space until you get around to them. The game's biggest selling point, the thing the game is extremely proud of, and advertises on the back of the box even, is that they can get 9 guys comfortably on screen at the same time, without dropping frames. Doing some research for old articles, there's a funny one from IGN, where they released an apology for saying the game could do up to 8, and getting yelled at by THQ that it's up to 9, thank you very much. And while I will admit, it is a genuinely impressive graphical achievement, it also makes the game absolute gobsmacking chaos. And not in a cool, fun way like Choo Choo Rocket or whatever, just in a way that makes you go, what in the blue f*** is happening right now? What am I even doing here? The other thing about this format is that it's nominally structured like a survival mode, where the stakes of the game are that you are one guy trying to endure and outlast and fight off wave after wave of enemy after enemy, and see how far you can get before you admit defeat. And if you're the best of the best, you can survive to the very end and win the Royal Rumble and go to WrestleMania, yeah! The funny sticking point here, though, is that if you get eliminated, because, again, it's absolute nonsense chaos, the competition does not end. Instead, the game says, "Aw, that's too bad," and simply asks you to pick a different wrestler and keep going. You get to pick a new guy. It gives you a fresh 3 minutes on the clock, but you don't have to start over. Your wrestler's eliminated count stays at whatever it's at. You just keep going. The first time I played this mode, the game was down to 2 people, and I got eliminated by the last guy, Kane. And instead of calling the match for Kane, it just had me pick someone new. I picked Jeff Hardy, eliminated Kane, and the game said, "Congratulations, Jeff Hardy, you have won the Royal Rumble." And then immediately rolled credits. I have to imagine this was a feature of the arcade structure, designed to cajole more quarters out of my pocket. But this is not an arcade cabinet. I brought no quarters, so it just removes any and all stakes. It feels like gaming nihilism. It simply continues until it ends, or until you leave. It does away with both the things that are cool about Royal Rumbles as a concept, and the things that are compelling about, like, the fundamental experience of competing in fucking video games. It's the worst of both worlds, top to bottom. By the way, you can play the Royal Rumble on multiplayer mode, but after a lot of cajoling, I convinced my wife to give it a try with me, and boy, if you think it was chaos for a seasoned-old wrestling game vet like me, it was tenfold so for her. And she stuck with it until the first time her character got eliminated, and then she said, "Nah, that's it," and refused to continue. And it's hard to really blame her. If you're wondering about all the other modes in the game, I apologize for glossing over it to begin with, but this game has 2 total options. You turn the game on, and you get this screen. If you're playing the game, and you're not playing Royal Rumble mode, by default, that means you're playing Exhibition mode. Exhibition mode is even more of a baffling nightmare than Royal Rumble mode. The moveset engine in this game is both too complicated to navigate, and yet boring as f***. The main moves, personally, are the same little punch, 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 and a couple basic tie-ups, with the further moves being really too complex to navigate in such a short time frame. And every move essentially does the same amount of damage, no matter what. As you get further into Exhibition mode, it becomes clear that the primary way to compete in this structure is this deeply strange Marvel vs. Capcom-ass team assistance thing. Before you start, the game has you pick an associate to come out with you, and I was confused as to why that could possibly matter, since there isn't any tag team matches or whatever. And then, within seconds of the first matchup, my opponent did a whistle, and suddenly I was getting double-teamed, to no disqualification of any sort. I shouldn't have been surprised that there was no conception of the rules of pro wrestling after how the Royal Rumble was contested, but it still made me laugh that it was just built into the fabric of the thing. I guess this is in some ways the ultimate pure representation of Attitude Era WWF, which is just short matches featuring no consistent rule enforcement and lots of interference. Because in addition to building up the ability to do tandem moves being the main way to play here, there's also random other guys that just run in to attack. But hilariously, they top out at 1 move, or about 5 seconds. And if you can just stay away from them for that span, they'll just leave on their own. I had a hysterical moment when both Hardys ran in, both did 450 splashes from the top rope, both of them missed and ate shit, and then just ran off. I wasn't sure of this at the time, but Exhibition mode is just you needing to win 10 consecutive matches for victory. And through 8 combatants, I rarely had to even build up the joint attack moves because the opponents were just complete pushovers. I was frequently winning matches in 30 or 40 seconds, and of course, because no rules just right, most of my wins should have been rope breaks. There was 2 weird things that happened through 8 matches, though. The first was that a handful of times, seemingly in randomly occurring fashion during matches, the lights would go out, and we would all just get transported to the entrance ramp, or a cage, or a back hallway, and suddenly there were weapons, and we had to finish the match here? What on earth? I had a lot of trouble the first few times this happened, realizing what the rules were here, because the interfering partners also came with us, so it's just nonsense chaos again. The second thing is that apparently this mode also has a 3-minute time limit, and if you run out of time and end up in a draw, it just counts as a loss, and you have to start over. But again, you just pick a new guy, without any punishment, and keep going, so... Anyway, I blasted through the first 8 guys on the challenge in about 25 combined minutes flat, according to my footage. And then for some reason, the 9th guy, no matter who it was, became way overpowered and difficult to beat. It took me 40 minutes to beat just the 9th position guy. But I finally did, and this allowed me to move on to the 10th and final round, to take on the big boss, the most difficult, the most accomplished and dominant wrestler in the company. The one that would put all the others, from Undertaker and Kane to The Rock and Stone Cold to Triple H and Mankind, to shame. I am, of course, talking about Vince McMahon. The character of Vince McMahon in WWF Royal Rumble is so difficult, so cheap, so insanely overpowered, that it sorta defies belief. I've never played any of the Dark Souls games, but I have a tough time imagining any individual boss being more ludicrously, unfairly OP than Vince is here. And at least there's presumably a clever conceit to the strategy of beating them. Here, Vince is, for all intents and purposes, basically invincible. Get it, Vince? He can easily block all your attacks. His strikes do somewhere between 3 and 5 times as much damage as yours do. He recovers more quickly, and as his partner, he has his son, Shane McMahon, the second most powerful character in the game. If you play level 10 long enough, and boy howdy, did I ever, occasionally the game will throw you a bone and have Shane be the final guy. And while this did result in me getting tantalizingly closer on the regular than I did fighting Vince, I still lost. Constantly. I wrestled Vince or Shane for well over an hour, and a predominant amount of those matchups ended in straight knockouts, where I had been so thoroughly destroyed so quickly that I couldn't even get up. I say well over an hour because it took so long to beat him that I actually had to stop the recording because I was running out of space on my computer making the Buzz Lightyear video. But I was gonna be goddamned if I didn't finish stupid fucking WWF Royal Rumble in that one sitting. Especially getting so close and having such an awful time. And so I lost, and lost, and lost, and lost, and lost, and lost, and lost. I really worked hard to learn the timing and structure of the run-in system, as well as the specific moves, but I was powerless again and again versus the utterly dominant McMahon boys. I had a couple real chances against Shane when we got transported to the secret back rooms, but even those I ran out of time on, or got KO'd again. So as I played straight through dinner time and almost up to bedtime, my struggles remained off-screen. And as such, my moment of triumph when I finally managed to string enough together and defeat the mighty Vince McMahon, the greatest wrestler of all time. When that happened, I now don't even remember exactly how I did it. All the evidence I have is this final winner screen that feeds right into a lackluster credit roll and goes right back to the main menu. The big benefit I had earned is that now I could play as Vince, but his mega OP-ass power levels had been nerfed to regular limits, and as such, he played exactly the same as everybody else. I tried a few moves, and that was it. I turned the game off. I had now seen absolutely everything the WWF Royal Rumble had to offer. This is like finding out that a cool-looking game you bought for the Nintendo Switch that feels like a real, full experience actually used to be like a shitty little app game or something. I felt like I'd been sold a false bill of goods. I was promised a team-up by the biggest developer and the biggest publisher in the pro wrestling video game media ecosystem, featuring the most famous wrestling company in the world at arguably its most culturally prominent moment on the most powerful system available at the time, with assistance from the console's creators. And what I received instead was a hilariously thin, repetitive, limited, broken-ass arcade game, structured to scam quarters from me, while being released in a format that is not asking quarters from me. At a time when the arcade was dying anyway, so it's asinine that anyone would develop an arcade-first structured wrestling video game. It had been 5 years of enormous growth for pro wrestling, video games, and pro wrestling video games, but somehow we were back to power move pro wrestling, with little to keep your interest past the first couple games, other than check out these visuals. Visuals move fast, though, and their novelty expires quickly. And sadly, WWF Royal Rumble was just aiming way, way lower in its ambitions than a game with its creative and promotional pedigree ever should. But even as an approachable party game, it's so limited in its structure that it's way less appealing to want to do with friends than the THQ Aki games on N64. Since it only has the one match type, and with such a comically limited roster, and it obviously doesn't have anything approaching SmackDown's narrative depth. THQ and Yuke's did put out a second SmackDown game, and it rocked! THQ and Aki also put out a follow-up to WrestleMania 2000 on the N64 hardware called No Mercy, that is considered a masterpiece. But Royal Rumble was the single and only post-Acclaim WWF game that the Dreamcast got. And other than Acclaim's god-awful ECW games that ran on their Attitude engine after WWF kicked them to the curb, one of which I still have left to cover, there were no more wrestling games on the system, at least in America. And THQ very pointedly said that they were forsaking the system altogether, wagering that it would die a permanent death when the PlayStation 2 came down the pipe, a prediction that was basically spot on. But to end this video on a positive note, I have exciting news. WWF Royal Rumble was not the only wrestling game released for the Dreamcast in the second week of August of the year 2000. 4 days prior to Rumble's release in America, Big Sega put out their third entry in the Japan-exclusive Giant Graham series for All Japan Pro Wrestling, and I'm happy to report that Giant Graham 2000 f***ing rips! It takes the stuff I was seeing in the first AJPW game on Saturn and expands them exponentially. It's gorgeous visually, the crowd noise is excellent, it has a real sense of the pageantry that is an essential component of the art form, with thorough entrances and lots of streamers. The lineup is a wacky collection of current big deals and charismatic legends. The combat is fun, striking a great balance between the pick-up-and-play simplicity of the THQ games and the more complex features of Tokon Retsuden. And even better, it doesn't try to hide a bunch of its features from you to figure out on your own. It has this cool on-screen lightning button metric, similar to a QuickTime event, but less cumbersome, where if you're in a bind, you can do a quick surprise button move to get out of it. And even better, it shows it on the screen. If you get hit with a killer move, it flashes white and yells, "Damage!" Even in full Japanese, I was able to follow the rules and get right into it. And I spent the better part of a couple hours having a blast just playing it. Not to get footage, but just for fun. Giant Graham 2000 is weirdly hard to find, even on emulation, but it's worth getting, because it has everything WWF Royal Rumble lacks, ignores, and eschews. And if you're looking for a Dreamcast wrestling game, this is the one to get. Because it actively likes, respects, and understands wrestling, and puts in the work to make you like and understand it as well. As opposed to the jittery, empty, broken-ass mess that is WWF Royal Rumble. Next time, join us on a journey through the history of video games, one lonely artifact at a time.